Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming to our lecture today. This lecture is hosted by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies. We're an interdisciplinary research center here on campus that funds research about the Intermountain West. We bring lecturers in to come speak to us and other kinds of public programming. We have the room until noon or a little bit after. Some of you probably will have to leave for class. So at 11:50, and we'll warn our speaker, at 11:50, some people may stand up and there may be a general exodus from the room. You didn't offend them by something you said. They're just going to their next class.
I don't presuppose that I won't offend you.
Okay. Maybe he will have offended you. But just try to, if you need to leave, that's fine. Just try to do so quietly. We do have the room for a while, though, so we will have some time for Q&A afterwards. We'll start today. The office specialist from the Redd Center, Amy Carlin, is going to offer us an invocation, and then the Redd Center director, Brian Cannon, will introduce today's speaker.
Our Father in heaven, we are so grateful for the opportunity that we have to be gathered here at this university. We are grateful for our speaker today and ask that thou wilt bless him, that he may deliver the address he has prepared and that his mind may be clear. We ask that our minds may be receptive of what he has to tell us and that we may learn and all be edified. We love thee and say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Joseph E. Taylor. He goes by the name of Jay, and so that's how I'll refer to him. Professor Taylor received his PhD in history from the University of Washington. He received a master's degree and a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Oregon. He grew up in the American West along the Pacific coast and spent considerable time in his youth wandering around Western North America. First of all on vacations, and later as a commercial fisher and truck driver. And that helps to explain his scholarly fascination with the region and with resource usage and the environment in the region. He taught for 7 years in the history department at Iowa State University, and he's been teaching in the history department at Simon Fraser University since 2004. His primary fields of research over the last decade are environmental history and the history of Western North America. His publications have focused on Pacific salmon fisheries and the history of modern rock climbing. And he's received numerous awards for his publications, and I'll just identify a few of them for you. He received the Phi Alpha Theta Westerners International Prize for his research on salmon. He received the Oscar O. Winther Prize from the Western History Association and the George Perkins Marsh Prize from the American Society for Environmental History. And he also received the Theodore Blagan Award from the Forest History Society. So numerous awards for his research dealing with timber and salmon and fisheries. In 2010, he received the National Outdoor Book Award in History and Biography for his history of rock climbing in the West, which is entitled Pilgrims of the Vertical. And he's here to speak to us today on a topic that he's been working on with colleagues at Stanford University, follow the money, mapping transfer payments, and unlearning wisdom about the federal domain in the American West. So please join me in welcoming Professor Taylor.
I want to thank both Brendan and Brian for bringing me here. This is a tremendous opportunity, and the Charles Redd Center has always been one of those institutions I've marveled at and wanted to be associated with because they've been responsible for doing some tremendous research on topics involving the American West and environmental history. I also want to do a shout out for Amy Carlin because she's the woman who actually got me here, and I really appreciate that always because I'm kind of lost when it comes to those sort of things. What I'm going to be talking about today at some level is kind of going to become, I fear, an object lesson in why only fools rush into certain topics, because the public lands is one of those discussions in the American West that is bound to anger at least half of your audience on any given day, depending on whom your audience is. I have a particular talent for angering the other half too, so be forewarned for that. That, in essence, is what Follow the Money is all about. It's a project I got drawn into a long time ago, and I won't go into the Shaggy Dog story of it right now, but essentially, I became curious in the fiscal relationships that went on between federal agencies that manage the federal domain in the American West and the states and counties of the American West. And to do that, I needed to trace these payments, which have turned out to be a mess to try and follow for a variety of reasons. Last year, I received a John Topham and Susan Red Butler off-campus faculty award to do that research last spring, and that's the genesis of why I'm here now. In essence, some of this talk is quite literally what I did on my summer vacation. But to get to that point, and to explain why I think this matters, we have to start off by deconstructing some of the things we actually already know. Most importantly, it's this map of the American West. For anybody who grew up in this region, this is second nature to us all. You know, we know just how ubiquitous federal lands are around the American West. It's what we live with. It's largely what attracts us in various ways to this region. For people outside the West, however, this is actually a lost or unknown geography. And this is why I love Frank Jacobs' map from The Big Think, because it drives home a point that is actually shocking to people who live east of the 100th meridian, and sometimes even as far west as Nebraska and Kansas and places like that, because they don't have this reality. This map, more than any other I've ever seen, drives home one of the fundamental existential facets of being a Westerner. But it doesn't explain everything by a long shot, which is why I think we have to think about something else. It's not simply the amount of federal lands in each state, which can be spectacular in the case of Nevada. But if we add to that state lands, which in some places are significant, especially Arizona and New Mexico, because of grants given to the states back in the early 20th century when they became states, and then we add to that another lost set of landscapes, which are tribal lands. And we begin to add up these totals, and we get to what I think is the single most important facet of this, the thing that almost nobody actually talks about. Because all of these lands, these state, federal, and tribal lands, are also untaxable lands. If you want to get to a fundamental challenge of governing in the West, and especially providing social services, this is the inescapable truth that has been at the core of the Western relationship to the federal domain for a very, very long time. In fact, from the very beginning of the discussions about what to do with the federal domain, this has been at the center of those issues. Back in 1905 and 1906, when the federal government decided to permanently transfer the forest reserves to a new agency called the Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot immediately looked upon this as his windfall. What he wanted more than anything else was to begin to lease, conduct timber sales and grazing leases and hold on to that money. It would make the Forest Service a self-sustaining operation, he argued. He was never right about that part, but he also miscalculated from the beginning because Westerners who had already been complaining about lost tax bases raised a hue and a cry. And in 1906, Congress, which involved not just Westerners, but Easterners and Southerners as well, agreed to begin to set aside a portion of the leases and sales to send back to the counties to compensate for these lost taxes. By 1908, they had made those payments permanent. It started as 10%. By 1908, it was 25%. By 1930, it was 35%. That figure is important going forward because it set the standard for a series of other laws. In 1916, when Congress took back over 2 million acres of highly valuable forest in western Oregon, they again set aside 35% to go back to the counties. The law was so badly written that they had to rewrite it 20 years later. But we can see where the standard and the precedents are beginning to take hold. In 1920, when Congress finally passed the Federal Mineral Leasing Act, 37.5% of the revenues went back to the states to be redistributed as they wished. 52% went to the Reclamation Fund. In other words, Congress was increasingly redistributing a large amount of these revenues. And in the case of the Federal Mineral Leasing Act, it's a huge amount of revenues because minerals just generate a lot more revenue than anything else. This is going back to the states and to the counties. The same was true of the Federal Water Power Act the same year. When Congress finally got around to dealing with much of the rest of the public domain in 1934 with the Taylor Grazing Act, again, 50% of those revenues went back to the states and counties. 3 years later, with the Bankhead-Jones Farm Tenant Act, a similar percentage went back to the counties. And in 1947, when they finally got around to dealing with really sand and gravel mining going on the BLM lands, they did a similar sort of apportionment. These are really important because they are the substantive relationship between the federal government and states and counties in the West. And they've been around from the very beginning. And from the very beginning, this has constituted a kind of government out of sight. A transfer of payments is fundamental to providing social services in the West, especially at the county level in terms of roads and schools. And that's the way it was supposed to work for a very long time. By the mid-70s, however, two things were converging. One was other counties around the United States wanted to be compensated for their federal lands as well, none of which were ever as large as in the West. But it was also the case that that shifts in the way the federal government was managing forests and BLM lands, especially for recreational interests, for ecological concerns, protect species of various sorts, the revenues going to counties in the West were beginning to decline. So in 1976, they passed another law that has come to be known as payments in lieu of taxes that began to distribute money in 1978 to counties. It's a complex formula, and I can try to explain it if people want to know later. But essentially, it was a recognition that some of these lands were not generating sufficient revenues for the counties, and other lands that had been were generating less revenues. By the 1990s, and especially the owl crisis in the Pacific Northwest, money from timber revenues was declining very sharply in some regions, so they began with a compensation program in 1993 that was known as the Owl Payments Program. In the year 2000, that was nationalized as the Secure Rural Schools and Community Self-Determination Act, or SRS. And this represents another effort to compensate for programs that were beginning to stumble very badly. I'll be showing some maps in a little while to try and explain what the impact of these various programs were. But in essence, the maps come to be a way of tracking payments and the fate of industries across time, especially in the rural West. The Follow the Money program is an effort to try and make these provide graphic representations of these relationships. So what I want to do at this point is to go over to those maps. Here we go. And to trace through a series of relationships, and I'm going to highlight one county in each of these maps. But this is the first. This is the program that starts in 1906 with the Forest Service. And that first year, it turned out Washington was the only state that got any payments out of it. And that was as much a bookkeeping problem as anything else. But if I take you through these maps, and I'm going to go from 1906 to 1944, get a sense, you're going to get several senses. One is how logging on federal lands will proceed over several decades, but also where the data is missing, in a sense. White means there's no payments. Gray means we don't know what's going on. So 1907 and beyond, and pay attention especially to this county up here. That's Ferry County in northern Washington. By 1910, what we're beginning to see is a distribution of monies across the American West in various places. By the late teens, especially, it's been good. World War I was good times in the Forest Service industry. Among other things, even planes were made of wood. This is a time of really good payments. By the middle 1920s, it's no longer such good times. And by the late 20s, we're already seeing the impact of the Depression in the West beginning to take hold in terms of natural resources. And it just gets worse and worse and harder across the time. It's only with in the late 1930s that the industry begins to rebound. But by that point in time, we can also begin to see a shift, because it's at this very moment in the late 30s and early 40s that the timber industry is going to shift from the northern Rockies and from the northern Pacific Northwest down into Oregon. And by 1944, Oregon is becoming the epicenter of the timber industry, and it will continue to be for the next 30 years. Essentially, a generation and a half of working class loggers had very, very good times in the Pacific Northwest, starting with World War II. In Ferry County in particular, and Ferry County is not a particularly unusual timber county in the sense that it's in northern Washington, and 86% of the land is federal lands. Actually in Ferry County, it's really less than 2% that's private lands, because the other large holder is the Colville Reservation. So for them, these monies are critical. They are the lifeblood of good roads and schools. Okay, if I go on to the next, I'm going to just get rid of, no, I'm going to say that for now. The next payment program is the Federal Mineral Leasing Act. And here, one of the things to note is that all these counties that have white in them, that's non-payments, but in some states like Nevada, Utah eventually, and other places in the West, the monies go into the state coffer and are never redistributed to the counties. With this program, I also want you to pay attention to Garfield County in western Colorado, which has 60% public lands in the state. These monies from the very beginning, one of the things to understand is, with this run from 1989 to 2016, which is a modern run, they constitute a large amount of money, and they offset taxes tremendously in these places. Tax policy in the West is largely predicated by not simply whether you have federal lands, but what kind of resources you have in your lands. If you're going to have federal lands, you want to root for minerals, because the income from minerals, if it is by state policy going back to your counties, makes a massive difference. Timber is second. The worst thing you can have is lots of grazing land. It's just not very remunerative at all. But from 1989 onward, we can see, and especially in Colorado and then eventually in Utah, how these lands come into particular areas of it. And this, one of the things to note with these maps is it's also telling you which counties actually have resources, because there are large sections, especially in Colorado, New Mexico, and other places, that have very few. Beginning in 2001, Utah decides to redistribute its monies back to the individual counties, and it's a godsend for these rural counties. Price and other places like that with coal mining, this is very important for them basically making ends meet. One of the unavoidable stories here, though, for me, is the gray in all this, because it's just very difficult to trace these payments from year to year, and I'll talk about that more at the end. Give you a third example, and this is the Secure Rural Schools, or no, the O&C payments, excuse me. The Oregon and California land grant was one of those classic 19th century railroad grants designed by Congress to subsidize the building of railroads in the American West. In this particular case, it was a boondoggle for a variety of reasons. The grants went out, and then because they largely ran through mountainous timber country, the railroads were never able to sell those lands as farmlands. And thus, by the late 19th century, the only real way they were going to liquidate those lands was through fraud and selling them on large scale to timber interests. Now, in the late 19th and early 20th century, that was really the only possible way of doing it. It was also illegal, and eventually the state of Oregon sues the railroad company, who by then was the Southern Pacific, and then try to reclaim the lands as state lands. At that point, the federal government stepped in, took over the lawsuit, and then claimed the lands back for themselves. The state of Oregon has never forgiven them for this. But over time, these lands were managed as incredibly lucrative timber lands. And they, as a result, because of that and because of the compensation, which was 50% of all revenues going back to these 18 counties in Western Oregon, the amount of money coming into these counties was sometimes tremendous. By the 1980s, however, because of both the exhaustion of old growth and because of the spotted owl crisis, which had their roots in the same issues, the amount of timber logging going on in these counties was declining very quickly. I want you to focus particularly on Linn County there, the outlined one, because it's actually one of the counties with fewer federal lands. Only 20% is in this program, and over half of the county is based in agriculture. Nevertheless, that timber, because it's so lucrative, was very, very important for Linn County. During the 1980s, we can see how the timber crisis begins to make for a more unstable industry. And then with the spotted owl crisis, especially in the early 1990s, how the money begins to go away. 1996 is the crisis moment, because at that point lawsuits were instituted so that almost no logging went on in certain counties, and Linn was the most affected. So if you go from the year before that, when it had $3 million worth of revenues, and in 1996 it had a little over 2,000. You can see the fiscal crisis that results in these places. I want to mention that in part because I'll come back to that at the end of this talk. But it's these moments that make a lot of rural Westerners distrust the federal government, and quite frankly, in a very partisan way. So, the next map I have here is the Pelt Maps. Now, payments in lieu of taxes was designed as a compensatory mechanism, a balancing wheel, if you will. Its formula was written in such a way that if you were a county in the West that had lots of minerals or lots of timber or grazing, it offset its payments. It had a straightforward formula of population, the amount of lands, that's how much money you would get. But if you had other revenues coming in, it would deduct those from the payments. It was designed to be a balancing wheel in that sense. Pelt emerges in the late 1970s because these payments are becoming more unstable, and across time, it continues to be, not continues, I misspoke, it becomes an ever more important payment program as the monies go away from these other programs. I want you to focus on Camas County, which is just an average county in Idaho. It has about 47% of its lands in public lands. It's going to get an average payment from these across time. What that program will do, based on whether there is more timber going on or less timber and mining going on in Camas, it will has the effect, as you can look at the line and look at the way this begins to take place down at the bottom here, it has the effect of balancing out. So Camas's revenues coming in for schools and roads stays relatively predictable across a long period of time. It's a very important program for Camas and many other counties. But one of the things I also want you to notice as I click this forward from here is how the West becomes greener and greener across time. Because as those other industries begin to falter, especially after 2000, we will see more and more of the West begin to take on some of its largest payments ever from this program. That's a marker of failure as well as success. The Pelt program is doing its job. The other programs are falling apart at the seams. And that gets us to the last program, which is the Secure Rural Schools program, which from the very beginning was grounded in the owl crisis and will always be biased towards Northern California, the Pacific Northwest, Idaho, and Western Montana. Excuse me. But I want you to focus particularly on this outlying county in Southern Oregon called Josephine County. I'm going to take you through the whole program beginning in 2001. And what you will see is solid green across that area. The monies were always biased towards the Pacific Northwest. I got to go back several here, tell a story very quickly. Through 2007, this was really a regional program for the most part and highly oriented towards timber. What happened in 2008? Yes. Congress decided to make double payments that year because everything got wiped out so badly. Basically, the program doubled up for everybody. So suddenly you get this huge infusion to a lot more counties in the West. And they also decided at that point that this was welfare, and they didn't like it. This is a Republican Congress, and basically they wanted to win the program. So they began a deliberate formula to take everybody off of this, to wean them off of all these welfare payments, and essentially Western counties are treated like any other welfare recipient during this period. And what we'll see is those payments begin to shrink and shrink and shrink across time. I want to go back here and show you a different form of graphing this, because there are two different ways we can map this. The way I've been showing you throughout this demonstration has been comparison between individual counties and all counties in the West. There's an advanced button down here if I can click on it. This is a set of comparisons within the county across time. So if you go back and look at that same program, what you see from the very beginning, because blue means big, payments, red means small payments. We will see that payments become, or no, I take it back. I've got the colors backwards here. Blue is least. What we're going to see across time is the amount of payments going to these timber counties has been shrinking almost from the beginning. By 2011, if I can go back to, Congress was talking about ending them completely. At that point, and this is how I got drawn into this project from the beginning, 11 counties in Oregon said if those payments go away, we go bankrupt. We simply don't have money for all the social services we're expected to provide. They weren't wrong. And there are some structural reasons why they were in a bind, but it was also the politics of taxation in the West, which doesn't go well ever. And in this particular case, especially in Southern Oregon, which is a very conservative part of the state, you basically had people time and again shooting down bonds in order to do things like buy sheriff's departments, keep schools open, keep libraries open. By 2013, there were people in Josephine County who were volunteering, basically saying, go ahead and get rid of the sheriff. We'll just start some vigilante patrols. And I'm not kidding. They were serious about that. But underlying this are these maps and these payments, because at a very basic level, these were counties in fiscal crises, not of their own makings. So with that in mind, this is the substance of what I've been up to with this project for quite a while. So what is it about these payments? Why should we be paying attention to them? Well, among other things, I think they undermine some of the most powerful narratives we have about the federal domain in the West. On the one hand, we have a group of rural Westerners who are struggling for a variety of reasons, who are increasingly casting, and for decades now, have been casting the federal government as a tyrannical overlord. At their most extremes, with people like Robert Lavoie Finicum, who was shot dead in Oregon a year ago. We have people who sincerely believe that the federal government is an illegitimate presence, that they have essentially appropriated liberties and rights from Westerners, and there are a lot of people who believe them. I witnessed front and center the takeover at the Malheur Reservation, Wildlife Reserve, and I can tell you they believe they believe in their heart what they're telling people, and I can tell you that they're crazy. The entire discussion about the federal domain goes away, and I don't know why no one ever brought this up to any of the people involved in the seizures. The entire discussion goes away if you go back and look at the Organic Acts passed by Congress to create every state since Ohio, because there is a clause in each one of them. This is the clause in the Organic Act for Utah, passed in 1894. Before any state could become a state, its citizens had to pass a law renouncing all claims to the unceded lands within their state. They don't become a state without saying this is federal land. And that's been true ever since Ohio in 1803. The clauses get longer across time, and they're kind of fascinating to read. By the time you get to New Mexico, Arizona, and Alaska, they go on for pages, and they have all these qualifications to them. But the substance is still the same. No state becomes a state without renouncing the federal lands within the state. So I don't know how this narrative has gone on as long as it has. Following these payments, though, also undermines the entire idea of tyranny, because without this fundamental relationship going on between federal agencies and the counties don't work. So at a basic level, it's a fundamental problem with this narrative. I want to suggest to you that environments have their own deeply problematic narratives. It begins with the progressive rhetoric of the people, which in every other aspect of the history of the progressive era, people have torn apart, historians have torn apart the rhetoric of the people. Robert Wiebe, I think, said it best when he said, "Never was so much claimed in the name of so many whom so few could locate." And nevertheless, within environmentalism and within environmental history, the notion of the people's lands continues to have tremendous resonance, as does the notion that the people who work on those lands are illegitimate. The rhetoric of welfare loggers and welfare miners and welfare ranchers has a substantive base in reality. They are all subsidized. There's no way around that point. And yet, if we push that logic very far, what we have come up with two very uncomfortable insights. One of which is we also should be talking about welfare hikers and welfare fly fishers and welfare river runners and welfare skiers. And when we look at what people are actually contributing in terms of fees to local economies, the only ones who are actually pulling their weight are those welfare loggers and welfare miners and welfare ranchers. The recreational contribution in terms of the ability to pay for social services in the rural West is nil. Most of those monies are transferred in very different ways. So for those reasons as well as others, the two dominant narratives break down. But even among scholars, I have some problems because I'm a cranky human being. Long ago, we shifted from talking about this as the public domain, to ignore the signs for a moment. It's really federal lands that we've been talking about for a long time, except when you start looking at the follow the money maps and think about the intrinsic relationship between federal lands and state and county governments, the best way I think to talk about these lands is as government lands, because there are multiple governments with deep stakes in the exploitation of these lands. And that's central to understanding the political economy that inheres in the federal domain of the American West. I think that's important because we need to recognize that political economy. We need to recognize how tangled these relationships and how deeply historical these relationships are, because we have real problems. Across the American West, we've been debating for decades now the problems of fire policy, of beetle damage, of overgrazing, and of the management of animals, whether it's feral horses and mules or cougars and bears and wolves or what have you, sage grouse. Oh my God, sage grouse. The reality is these are very, very tangled problems. And yet to pull on any one of them to try and resolve an ecological issue, we are already deeply entangled in a series of fiscal problems as well. Equally important, and this is where I'm going to defend Lavoie Finicum for a moment, there are also genuine problems with governance in the American West. Because the reality of the situation is that people who live closest to these lands, who depend on them most for their livelihoods, are engaged in a relationship with governance that most of us wouldn't tolerate. Lavoie Finicum was right. The people who write the rules and then enforce the rules and then adjudicate those rules, none of them are representationally chosen. The rural West, to the extent that rural Westerners work on federal domain, are working in a colonial state. They're not wrong about that. Equally important, there are a lot of environmentalists who recognize this imbalance as well, and it was stated most bluntly by Michael McCloskey, who was at the time the executive director of the Sierra Club. They like it that way. They like the fact that these lands are basically it's supposed to be everybody's lands, and that government should respond to the largest number, not the local. He was responding particularly to the rise of watershed councils in the West, local groups of people who are beginning to work with each other across lines, local environmentalists and local resource users, to try and find mutual accommodations to resolve these problems. And the Sierra Club leader was among the most conspicuous of those, saying, "Stop it. We don't want you doing this. We want to pull the strings ourselves." So this is a genuine problem that's been around for a long time, and nobody's really drawn at it directly. I think thinking about money in this particular case is a way of complicating these seemingly black and white issues. They are much more complex, and there are very real local consequences to what happens to these places. Now, for all that, and for all those reasons, I applied for a John Topham and Susan Red Butler Faculty Off-Campus Award, and I was very fortunate to get it. What it meant was that I could go and try and fill in some of these gray areas, and that was my road trip last spring. I decided to go on a long trip in order to try and figure this out. And part of the reason is that maps like this one, and Bankhead Jones is my white whale. It's my obsession. I'm trying to figure out a way of getting the data for this, because among other things, Natrona County, which is in Wyoming, did get payments. I've just not been able to find them. And thus I keep plowing away at this, trying to find where this data is located. And the goal was to go and visit state libraries and state archives and try and dig up as much as I could auditing and treasurer reports at the county and state level that might give me this. So I went on a road trip. From Portland, my first stop was to clean up some things down in Carson City. I managed to find 61 county-level audits. The next day, I was off to Phoenix, where I found 75 biennial auditor and treasurer reports from 1907 to 2016. The next day I was in Albuquerque. I'm a road warrior. Where I found 18 biennial auditor reports from 1907 to 1954. This was probably my single best day of research during this period. The following day I spent in Santa Fe, where I went to the state archives and state libraries. I dug up 40 more biennial auditor reports, plus 22 Forest Service and Taylor Grazing Act reports since 2000. Those were really good. The following week, I was in Denver all week long, or at least in the area, where I stopped at Denver Public Library, Denver University, and the University of Colorado, at various state agencies as well. In all that time, in that whole week, in other ways, it was a really good week of research, but in that whole week, I found 7 reports. That's it. The following week, I started in Cheyenne, where I found 37 biennial auditor and treasurer reports. Half of them were useless. The following day, I was in Helena, and I found 16 biennial auditor reports from 1907 to 1936. What I discovered was in 1934, the auditor stopped counting. They never started counting again. That's it. That's all we're ever going to get from the state of Montana. And the following day, I found 57 reports in Boise, of which exactly 1 had any data. The upshot of this, because over half of it turned out to have nothing of use, is that we have some genuine problems with data. I went home and I sulked for a while. At the county level, what we have are irregular habits of auditing. Sometimes they audit, sometimes they don't. What they count and what they don't count. There doesn't seem to be any even statewide consistency on this, let alone beyond that. And quite frankly, the professionalism of the auditors who are involved at the county level can be questioned for a variety of reasons. The result is it's not a reliable place oftentimes. Of late, it's become more, that scale of information has become more reliable, but only relatively so. And there's some real limits to that as well. Let me go back here. I need to go back one. At the state level, there's also irregular tracking, because sometimes counties decide that they want to count this stuff, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they decide to lump all federal payments together. Sometimes they decide to round those numbers off. Whenever any of those things happen, you end up with blank spots on the map. Beyond that, though, there's also an auditing reform that happens nationwide, starting in the 50s, but really gets traction in the West in the late 60s and early 70s, where they go to a fundamentally different system, and these payments are simply not considered important. Following the passage of Pelt, the payments disappear altogether because the states it's in their vested interest not to pay attention to any monies that go directly to counties. They're called pass-through payments, and thus the state gets more money from Pelt if they simply don't report those data. This is called a loophole in a law. It's called a nightmare for historians. There's also the problem of the Federal Mineral Leasing Act, which some states just gobble up. And to give you one example, California from the very beginning never sent in any regular way this money out to counties. By the late 1920s, they had put all of it into what was called the Junior College Fund, what we would most people call community colleges. And for the next quarter century, those monies went to pay for the building up of California's community colleges. Where were the first colleges? San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, and Sacramento. They're not going to the counties where mineral leasing was actually taking place. The federal level is even worse, and in some ways it's my most frustrating experience over time, because outside of the reporting for the ONC lands and the PILT and SRS, which they're mandated to do at the county level, the Forest Service and the BLM have done very little in terms of making those payments transparent. And to the extent that this data is archived, they're not really willing to share. They've become proprietary in recent years, and I suspect part of it is they're understaffed and underpaid. I suspect part of it is because they feel besieged, because they're worried that any bit of data is going to be used against them in a lawsuit. And part of it is that they just don't like the public very much. The Forest Service is particularly user-unfriendly in this respect, but that's a lifelong problem of the Forest Service culture. As a result, we've had to resort to FOIAs, and so far, over 4 years, we've had exactly 0 success with them. It's kind of like playing 20 questions, where you feel like you want to start by asking, is it bigger than a bread box or something like that, because it's really very difficult to get them to actually cough up this data. Finally, in the last 2 years, the federal government has issued no reports, so even Pelt and SRS are not apparent in terms of what they're going on. I don't know how I'm going to be able to map the entire political economy of these lands across time. I don't know when the data runs out and when I reach that point of diminishing returns. I do know that it matters a great deal, and the way I want to explain this is by finishing with 2 overlays. The first involves the research by Ann Case and Angus Deaton. I'm curious, how many of you are familiar with this research at this point? A couple of years ago, these 2 demographers started digging through data on life expectancy, and they came up with a very disturbing insight, which was essentially that people between 45 and 54, middle-aged, white, working-class Americans without college educations, are dying faster than their parents. It's not just that they're not doing as well as the previous generations, they're actually dying younger now. When they looked at the causes, they zeroed in especially on drinking, drug abuse, and suicide, which they came to call the wonderful phrase, deaths of despair. This is a mapping of what's happened to those people across the last 15 years, and it's not a happy story. What I want you to do in this map is just focus on the growth of this problem in the American West, and especially the interior West. In their second study, which came out this last spring, they presented this data. Case and Deaton took some time to look at regional trends. And when they got to the West, they wanted to juxtapose Nevada and Utah. And Utah in part because they said, this is a communal culture, this is people who take care of themselves, we should expect higher data. The problem was that the differences collapsed. In terms of suicides, drug abuse, poisoning, and other things like that, Utah is in the bottom quintile. It's 10th. Nevada's worse at 4th. But the distinctions are largely collapsing. And what they're left with is a signal that's ever clear that if you don't have a college education, if you work in the blue-collar industry, you're going to die sooner than your parents' generation on average. It's bad, and it's getting worse. This is what they mean by deaths of despair. And the geography is overlain to a strong extent with the geography I've been tracing in my mapping project as well. The second thing I want to do, and I want to end with less certitude, I'll be honest at the front end, because I haven't crunched the numbers enough on this yet. So I want to talk about the political implications of all of this. There was a time not that long ago when congressional representation in the West was bipartisan, when this was a purple world in very real ways. I'm going to show you a series of maps of congressional elections every 4 years, starting with 1970, because I don't want to overlay with the presidential elections because the messages tend to get muddier with that. To just show you what happens with this representation, beginning with 1970, 1974, not much change really. Then 1978, and I'm going to come back to this year, 1982, 1986, 1990, we can see the trend growing. 1994, and especially 1998, the other year I want to talk about. 2002, 2006, 2010, and 2014. The West was a rather Republican-dominated world in the 19th century, but that went away after 1900 and really remained resilient well into the 1970s, and then it goes away. I don't think we have a good explanation, but I'm going to offer you a hypothesis that I won't say is mathematically very strong yet. The two watershed years for me in looking at these maps and other issues around them was 1978 and 1998. 78 came at the height of the Sagebrush Rebellion. And a lot of it was a reaction, especially in the interior West, to what was happening in timber, mining, and other things. I want to suggest to you that a lot of the rightward tilt that begins to happen in the West is a reaction to environmentalism, and especially the increasing association of just the Democratic Party with environmentalism. 1998 came after Escalante Grand Staircase. And what you see is an ever more resilient West that increasingly distrusts the federal government. This is long after we've already seen the county rights movements and other facets of that. And what we're looking at is increasingly a fundamentalism in the rural West among conservatives that looks at the federal government as the enemy. And by extension, because of the political rhetoric going on between the two parties, that the Democratic Party has come to be understood as the environmentalist party and thus the enemy. And I think this goes a long ways to understanding the resilience of the Red West well into the 21st century. I want to suggest that there are good reasons why people distrust this. Think about the case and deed in data. Think about the fiscal relationships that go on between counties and social services. Again, the case and deed in data, and especially the association with lack of education, the public lands, and their intrinsic relationship to public education in these counties. And we're seeing a difficult relationship right now. And neither of the dominant narratives have anything to say about this. I am a nonpartisan on this. I am equally disgusted with both sides. That's why I'm doing this research. And that's why I think these maps matter. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. You just want to call out on people, Jay?
Yeah.
There's one here in the back.
Oh, where? Okay, sorry.
I haven't studied much of this formally. I'm not a historian, but my great-great-grandfather lived in a valley just west of here, and he was part of family lore. I find it difficult to find documentation about this, but family lore says that he helped the feds take over the landscape. But before that, he apparently thought of as a colonist.
Right.
And he was anxious that the rich people in town would put more cows than his share on the commons, and then so he thought the federal government and control that so that it was more equal access to this commons land.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering about Finicum and his ideas of independence and this concept of the commons that came from England.
Finicum is very much playing on those notions. There are, and I don't have the names down pat yet, but there's a key figure in conservative Mormon culture who has been leading this argument for a very long time. His roots go back to the Cold War era and his connections especially to very, very far right-wing denunciations of government. They are following a kind of cherry-picking argument drawing from common law, from the Constitution. The people who took over, both at Bunkerville down in Nevada with Cliven Bundy's ranch, and the people who took over the wildlife refuge, carry around their back pocket a specially printed Constitution. They say it is the Constitution, but if you read it, it's actually a subset of the clauses and passages that they've cobbled together, kind of like Jefferson's Bible, to get at what they call the true Constitution. And it's one that would, if you read it straight, says, no, the federal government doesn't own any of this land. No, that these are common law practices, and the people who came here first and found empty lands, which is itself a historical construct that is deeply problematic, and then tame that land and put it to use, are the people who actually own it. So that's the roots of that argument. I'll bet you your great-great-grandfather was as concerned with sheep as cattle in that respect. Well, the other thing I'd say, and just to get it out in the first, my great-grandfather was the tailor who wrote the Taylor Grazing Act. So, and what I'll tell you from looking, it's problematic, and he was ambivalent of it, because he fought for the better part of his career, first as a senator in Colorado, and then for 33 years in Congress, to try and get those lands shifted to the state. And that's part of the story I'm telling in one of the books I'm researching right now. There's a lot of path dependency in this, but in the end, what they all tried to do, Westerners and Easterners and Southerners together, because they constituted different interest groups on these issues, they tried to find legislation that would work for all parties concerned. And nobody was happy with what came out, but everybody was satisfied that it would do enough. And we've lost not simply the understanding of that, but the temperament that even tries to find that ground anymore. And your family was struggling with trying to deal with the problem, and a lot of people didn't quite understand what the federal domain actually was. Partly because in the 19th century, the notion was you were going to come, you were going to make a claim, you were going to prove up for 5 years, and this land would become yours. And in the 19th and early 20th century, really up until the Taylor Grazing Act, that open domain was understood to be open to grazing. And everybody regarded it as problematic because they wanted regulation on those lands. And at the same time, almost nobody could make ends meet without access to those lands, because that's the reality of the arid West in general.
But there's for people like Finicum, there's a conflict that they don't recognize between this concept of the commons and the concept of prior appropriation. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I think it's best to understand them as true believers. They already know truth, and they're simply trying to persuade other people of what the truth of the situation is. They're not actually engaged in debate. And these are not factually grounded discussions that happen with these people. Go ahead.
Are the Bundys and the Finicums outliers? As a person who made his living on public land grazing permits, I find it difficult to understand. The assumption in our part of the world, southeastern Utah, we accepted the order brought by the federal agencies to the public lands. There was chaos before; it was impossible.
Well, it was very dangerous. I mean, because
it was very bad for the land.
Yeah, but it was also, because of the deadlines that were imposed by grazers, people got shot when they wandered onto land they didn't recognize they shouldn't be on. The cattle and sheep wars that went on forever and a day were partly ecological and partly economic. They were also partly racial. There were a lot of points of division between those different interests across time, but it wasn't that people were opposed to regulation. It was who was going to regulate and how, and who was going to benefit, and those were tangled issues that took a long time to resolve. But having said that, demographically, they are outliers. In a country of 330 million people, you can have a lot of outliers. I'll put it that way. But back when Cliven Bundy was resisting several years ago, and it first made headlines before he started talking about how happy blacks would be as slaves again. There were a lot of people criticizing. But also a lot of conservatives backing him. One of the most interesting facets of this was Glenn Beck, who is himself deeply conservative. But as he said on his radio show, he also owned a ranch, and he paid his fees for his permit. And he had no interest in backing Bundy. So even when you see conservatives, really conspicuous conservatives from the ranching community who walk away from this guy, you realize he's pretty marginal. Okay. That said, and this is my habit. I try to take both sides. The Bundy family is a sympathetic family. They were not treated well by the federal government going back to the 19th century. They're driven out of the Arizona Strip, which they went to first after polygamy was outlawed, and then driven from there into Nevada. And they leased for decades, but come the late 1980s, early 1990s, they suddenly found their access to their historic grazing areas being shut down because the Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt, had decided to make that endangered tortoise habitat by transferring tortoises from outside of Las Vegas to these lands because they were going to build in Las Vegas. So this had become tortoise habitat in a way it wasn't before. And the Bundys, who were always marginal economic figures anyway, find their ability to continue basically shut off. So, and Bruce Babbitt, in his own autobiography, says he intended to break this industry. So, I have very little sympathy for the Bundys in terms of their arguments vis-a-vis federal sovereignty or any of that. And at the same time, that backstory helps you to understand why some juries find them sympathetic figures. These are messy stories. They're very messy stories. Anybody else? Yeah.
I'd just like to say, I hope you get to give this talk throughout the class, because this is the most measured, dispassionate, yet empathetic discussion of these issues I've heard in some time. And your subtitle suggests, that there's something wrong with the received wisdom we have about Western land policy. But if in fact part of that received wisdom is in what John Wesley Powell was telling us, what Wallace Stegner was telling us, it seems to me you're echoing them.
To a certain extent, I am. I mean, there are other facets of this that have to do with sovereignty, with the balance. One of the moving parts of this whole thing is climate change, because all our discussions about ecological management are basically up for grabs again. I spent 2 months this summer making sure my daughter didn't go outside and breathe the air in Oregon because it was so bad. At one point, the AQI outside of Bend, Oregon was in the 700s, which as late as 2005, people will tell you that was an impossible reading. So it was really horrible this summer. And at a very basic level, we're going to have to revisit the way we think about wilderness, logging in terms of maintaining forests, tending forests, because we're going to have to go back and rethink how we keep these things going in an era when, if we leave them to their own, they're going to fall apart at the seams. Grazing is another part of this. All these things have implications for local economies. They also have implications for aesthetic understandings of what constitutes nature, because North Americans really are the only people around the world who talk about wilderness as a thing. We're the only ones. Everywhere else, humans are in nature. It's only here that we think authentic nature is a place apart. And that's a tough road to hoe right now. I mean, part of this is going to be challenging fundamental received wisdom of environmental values. But it's also going to be telling people like the Bundys that the federal government is a legitimate sovereign, that this is something other than tyranny, and at the same time telling the federal government, if you want to be legitimate, you're going to have to get more buy-in from locals, and you're going to have to let them be a substantive part of the process. Now, that was true of the Taylor Grazing Act. The Taylor Grazing Act is really the first example, national example, of what we would call co-management. Environmentalists hate it.
Yeah, well, and that's what I meant in a sense. Is it seems to me Powell and Stegner were both advocates of that kind of co-management, right? That in a way you needed the federal government. The federal government, in a way, had to be responsive to the needs of people who actually, democratic communities in the West.
I think Stegner is more that. Powell wanted it all to go off to individual communities. He wanted to have these watershed-type governments, and the federal government wouldn't have been involved in Powell's vision. Stegner was more that way, but Stegner, it depends which Stegner you're talking about, the one in the middle of his career or the cranky old guy at the end of his career, because he shifts across time, too, and all this. Brendan. My eyes are so bad I can barely see you.
Can you comment on how does this then interact with the current ALEC and public lands initiative, transfer public lands to state movements coming out of Utah and other places?
I don't think there's one movement.
If they were in the room, what would you want them to take away from your presentation?
They're not helping. That's the first thing I would say. Because ALEC is the modern analog to Gifford Pinchot's National Conservation Association. Both are top-down organizations that do a lot of astroturfing. They both wrote model legislation, and they have both tried to do so for interests that weren't really concerned with locals. I don't regard ALEC as really giving a damn about locals. It's very much a corporate-oriented thing. And I share the environmental community's distrust of ALEC in particular. But that doesn't mean that everybody who wants local control is a tool of ALEC. And that's one of the things I want people to recognize, is that there are multiple impulses towards this. I'm not a great fan of your Representative Bishop either, who I think is historically challenged in all sorts of ways. But, and I don't think that solves the problem, because for locals, here's the problem. If suddenly the federal government were to say, fine, we're done with this, the states get all this land, I think, with a few exceptions, and this is the state where it's more so than others, the substance of management doesn't change much, because the states and the counties still have a vested interest in managing these lands. Neither of them believes that most of them are going to be privatized, nor that privatization would make much sense. And there are not many people out there who are willing to buy up much of this land as it is across time. And I come from a state, Oregon, where the state basically had to buy back timberlands after they all burned up in the 1930s and 40s and early 50s. So, privatization, the governor of this state in 1931 went to Congress and said privatization doesn't work with this problem. So this has been a recognition for a very long time. Yes?
On that same note, how do you think that would affect the counties financially if you were to gain these subsidies?
Again, it depends on how it depends on taxation policy, which is itself warped at this point for all sorts of reasons. I mean, corporations are among the most subsidized entities in America. So, every tax break takes something away from somebody. And one of the problems with this whole arrangement, Brian Below had the phrase government out of sight. People, even at the county level, people who receive these monies have told me they don't know where they're coming from or why. Okay? When you get to the average taxpayer, it's tabula rasa on this point. So, this is part of what I'm up to with this project, is just schooling people on essentially why there's money, where it comes from, how it comes there, what it's supposed to do, and what happens when it goes away. Anybody else?
I think it's about time.
Thank you.
Thanks.